All right. Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, your favorite conservatarian, Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. Got another fire conversation for you guys today. We're talking education again, but kind of a different aspect of education. So we'll be getting to that in just a second. But before we do, you know what you got to do. You got to hit that like button. You got to hit that share button. Share it. You got to hit that subscribe button. Also, smash that notification bell. That way you will be updated whenever I upload a new interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. Also, if you want to support my work monetarily, you got the links in the show notes below. We've got the PayPal app, the Venmo app, the CashApp, and all the other apps. Every little bit counts, and I appreciate it. Helps me bring you this wonderful content to you, my viewer, who I love. Now, we're going to talk about education, and we're going to talk specifically about Catholic schools, which are very important when it comes to the issue of school choice, which is really hot right now. There's a big push for it. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on my guest. She is an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute and also superintendent of partnership schools. I have Kathleen Porter-Magee. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one because I've been talking a lot about school choice, and this is right in your wheelhouse. So before we get into everything, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So as you said, I am superintendent at Partnership Schools. So I'll talk a little bit about what Partnership Schools is. So we are a private school management organization. So think of it, for anybody that knows the charter worlds, the charter school world, there are charter management organizations that run public charter schools. We are a private school management organization. So we are an independent nonprofit organization. We have right now agreements with two dioceses, the Archdiocese of New York and the Diocese of Cleveland, where the dioceses have turned over full operational and managerial control over a subset of their once struggling urban Catholic schools. And we have taken on full control of them, are in charge of all hiring and firing, all decisions about curriculum and instruction, and are also fully financially responsible for them. So we run now 11 urban Catholic schools. We have 4 in Harlem, 3 in the South Bronx, and just hot off the presses, starting this month, 4 in Cleveland, Ohio. We added 2 schools to our network in Cleveland this July. So, nice. So that's my day job. Huh? Yeah.
That's cool. I didn't even know that organizations like that existed. I just figured private schools, especially Catholic schools, would just run their own stuff or be run by the diocese or the church or however it works. So that's very interesting.
We're a rarefied breed. There are not that many of us, honestly. I think right now I believe we are the only organization in the country that has an operational agreement with the diocese like ours, where we have full autonomy and control over the schools we run. In exchange, we are fully accountable to the archdiocese or the diocese. So you are correct. It is unique. And we believe, because we know that urban Catholic schools, the story, particularly for the last 20 years, has been a story of like slow and steady struggle and decline. And so we are part of a movement to really revitalize the sector of urban Catholic schools, which we believe are not just important to the ministry of the church, but also critical to the fabric of K-12 education in America. So we are part of what we hope will be a fledgling and burgeoning movement. So.
Good. So now I wanted to ask you about what you just said. Because I've always heard about how a lot of Catholic schools struggle. Private schools in general. How do they compare to other private schools? do most private schools go through this, or is there something specific that Catholic schools deal with specifically, or?
Yeah, the Catholic school sector is unique because it is the only, so it's the largest non-public school sector in the world, which is actually amazing when you think about it. And what is unique about the American system of Catholic schools, to the extent that it's a system, because it's actually really pretty autonomous, but the system is the only private school system to serve low-income communities at scale. And so that is what sets it apart. It's also what leads to some of the struggles that we've been facing over the past 20 years as costs to educate have increased. We're still nothing compared to public or charter schools, but still have increased. So as we face some financial challenges, the Catholic schools that serve the urban poor have struggled. And that is unique because most most private schools serve the elite, and Catholic schools, that is not their mission. So it is, I think it's a pretty unique difference. So.
Okay, now that's interesting. I didn't know that either. I didn't realize that Catholic schools were so involved in serving low-income communities, which, I mean, would, again, place you at the center of this whole school choice movement, because that's one of the things that we want. We want for all children to be able to have access to quality education rather than just having elites being able to send their kids to private schools, which is funny because the people who oppose school choice, at least on the politician side, they have no problem sending their kids to private schools. Exactly. But when it comes to lower income children, so I would imagine that they're this is going to sound bad. They're probably not too fond of you guys because, I mean, these people really don't want for lower income us peasants to be able to have access to quality private education.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what it feels like. I will say on our end, definitely the people that are fighting choice, we present an inconvenient truth, right? So inconvenient because we educate at least half the cost. So if you look at our schools in New York, our annual cost to educate in New York is about $11,000 per pupil. That's how much it costs us to run our schools. In New York City, the public schools spend like $25,000 to $27,000. So it reminds me, there's like a beautiful hubris in the culture of urban Catholic schools that I love and like I feel really at home with. I can remember I grew up in New York in the late 70s and 80s. And I remember at the time, John Cardinal O'Connor, who was the Cardinal of the Archdiocese of New York, he was a champion for school choice, trying to push it, very early. And at the time, people were saying like, oh, well, of course, Catholic schools do better. You're able to take the best and the best. And he said at the time, okay, fine. He said to the New York City Department of Education, send us like your hardest to educate students, and we will do it better and we will do it cheaper. And nobody ever took him up on that offer, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, of course they didn't. They knew what was going to happen. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
So how would I do want to get into the report that you worked on, and we will, but I'm kind of curious, what do Catholic private schools do differently as far as how they educate students? How are they different from the public sector?
Well, I mean, the clearest and most obvious difference. So I believe that there is no such thing as a values neutral school. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because like, I think one of the ways that some folks who are hostile to school choice, one of the arguments that they make is like, well, we don't want to support religious schools because we need to separate. Values should not be taught, like religious values should not be taught in schools. And I believe there's no such thing as you're teaching values in schools. We just be unapologetic about the values we're teaching in schools. And so I think
especially nowadays, exactly. they're teaching some values in these public schools.
Yeah, and they always have, right? And that's, of course they have. It would be impossible to separate values from education. It doesn't even make any sense. The choices you make, the things you include, the things you choose not to include, those are all values-driven decisions, which is like, I don't think anybody should apologize for that. That's actually super critical to school effectiveness as far as I'm concerned. But one of the biggest differences is that Catholic schools have always been able to be unapologetic about who we are kind of at our core and what are the values and what is the faith that we teach. And so I think that's the biggest difference. There's like a whole host of other differences as well. I think Catholic schools have tended to be a little bit more kind of traditional in their approach, like continue. I think it's not uncommon when you go to your average Catholic school to continue to see a focus on, great books and that's because like at the core of Catholic education, like we believe education is about the search for objective truth. And so there's this like trying to understand like what is truth, what is beauty, and immersing kids in that from a really early age. That said, obviously the Catholic school system is very, very diverse, which I think is another thing that some folks may not realize is there's all kinds, there's, thousands of Catholic schools. There are all kinds of different Catholic schools, which is one of, I think, the beauties of the sector as well.
Gotcha. Okay. So I want to talk about a report that you guys worked on for Manhattan Institute, and it showed that Catholic school enrollment has gone up over the past few years. I know, just like all schools, they took a hit during COVID, but a lot of these Catholic schools have done even more than just recoup the attendance that they lost before. They've actually grown.
Yep.
So can you share some of the highlights from that report?
Yes. This was really good news for a weary sector. Again, like the story of Catholic schools in America, if you traced it over the past 20 years, it's really been a story of struggle and in many cases decline. Thousands of schools have closed, and they're almost entirely urban Catholic schools that serve, immigrant communities, that serve the urban poor. So it's really, I think it's a national tragedy. And so what was so remarkable about 2021 is that this nationwide enrollment increase. And so overall, Catholic school enrollment increased by about 3.8% nationwide, which is amazing when you consider that people like homeschooling increased, people were pulling their kids out of schools, but when they were pulling their kids out of public schools, increasingly they were looking to Catholic schools. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think we are only just beginning to understand the impact that our COVID-related school mitigation had on kids and on parents. And Catholic schools stood apart from that. So I can unpack this in a couple of different ways, but I think one of the most interesting statistics is in March 2020, Catholic schools were among the first to close in some communities, which is interesting and as sort of a little known fact. So if you track, there are a couple of different places that you can look at this, and you can see that Catholic schools were worried. They were seeing what was happening on the ground. Even in the Archdiocese of New York, we had announced our school shutdown on March 13th. The New York City public schools that same day were saying that they were going to remain open. De Blasio was saying he would not close. They closed soon afterwards, but essentially Catholic schools did not wait for anybody else's permission. They were like, this is dire. We are the epicenter. We are the national epicenter of a global, outbreak. Like this is worrisome. But then flash forward to August and September 2020, public schools didn't open, charter schools didn't open. It was Catholic schools that opened. And the one statistic that stands out is in September 2020, only 34% of public charter schools opened for in-person instruction, only 43% of traditional public schools, and 92% of Catholic schools opened for in-person or hybrid instruction, which is like that dichotomy it's like, that's the whole game on some level. Because I think what it showed, I think it showed a lot of things, but one of the things that I think it showed is that Catholic schools, one, are fearless, right? They can be in a crisis.
Yeah.
Two, they are responsive to their communities. Like many, I think by that time, by September 2020, we had a sense that this was not going away. Like this was no longer a 2 weeks to stop the spread moment.
Right.
We knew it wasn't going away. We had learned something. I mean, we hadn't learned everything about COVID mitigation, but we had learned something about it. And so we knew there were things that we could do to keep our communities safe. And we were responsive to we knew the parents needed it, and we knew that the kids needed it. And so I think that like September 2020 decision set the stage for the enrollment increases that we're seeing today. I think a lot of parents realized that like there's something different happening over here, and I'm interested, like, just because I want what's best. We all want what's best for our own kids, and like, this is a school that seems to be like thinking about like making these decisions motivated by something different.
You know what else it shows too? I mean, when they were doing these lockdown orders and having kids learn from home, I mean, they were making it sound like parents were just gung-ho about this. But if that were the case, you wouldn't have seen that increase. Even if you opened up early, you wouldn't have seen much of an increase at all. That shows that parents wanted their children to be in the classroom, even despite the risk of COVID. And I know that when COVID first hit, people didn't know what to expect. We didn't know what was going on. I mean, our government didn't. And, you know, and I have a little bit of grace for how things were handled at first because we didn't know what was going on. But as time went on, people figured out, okay, you know, kids are very unlikely to get the disease. And if they do, it's not having the same impact. So they felt safer putting their kids back in schools, but the schools didn't want to do it. So I can see that. So it further shows that more parents actually wanted their kids in the classroom.
Well, so you know what was interesting? This is anecdote, and I know the plural of anecdote is not data, but so we expanded. So we launched. We had our agreement with the Diocese of Cleveland. We signed it with them in mid-February 2020. Can you imagine? Right. And so we're like all gung-ho. We're going to open in July 2020. We had no idea what was coming like 3 weeks later. But so we launched, we expanded to our second diocese in Cleveland, Ohio in summer 2020. And so we were making this reopening decision. Our school, the two schools that we took over initially were significantly under enrolled at the time, like really like on a razor's edge in terms of their sustainability. But we marched forward and we reopened as we did in our New York schools. And we literally had the experience of parents driving by our two schools, seeing children in the playground, stopping, like screeching, turning in and saying, are your schools open right now? And we were like, yes, we are. And they were like, where do I sign up? And our enrollment in our two flagship Cleveland schools increased by 40% in our first month of opening. And I mean, a huge part of that was CMSD, which is the Cleveland Public School District, was closed, and we were not. And parents were like, this is something that, because we, you know, as parents, we know how important like community is to flourishing, right? Like we see that in our kids. And so I think that, I do think that that decision it made a huge difference. I guess the second thing, a second thing is just like the leadership. Because I will say, I don't want to paint the picture that when Catholic schools were reopening in 2020, this was easy. It was actually terrifying. Like it was hard. Because we experienced all the same fear. Our teachers experienced all the same fear. But we just we did what we could. And one of the things that's been one of my biggest takeaways, and that's been so interesting as a school leader through COVID, or a network leader, is that sometimes the way you build buy-in to something is just by doing it. And so when we reopened on the first day of school, because we had in 2020, we had both options. You could either come in for in-person or you could remain online, and we would do remote learning. And what we found is that it started with not that many students coming to in-person. And within the first week of us being opened, when all, you know what, didn't break loose, parents were like, okay, I feel a little bit better about this. And then they started to come back in. And we had some schools very quickly get to almost 100% of kids back in. But it took that moment of just saying, we know this is the right decision, and we're just going to do it.
Yeah, to create that tipping point when people feel safe because they see other people do it, then they're like, okay, here we go. Yeah.
Let's go. Let's give it a try. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say was the most surprising finding from this report, from this study? Like what surprised you the most about this?
Oh, what surprised me the most about it? You know, I guess maybe what surprised me the most was I guess maybe two things. So one is that this was a nationwide increase. So the NCEA, so we used NCEA, which is the National Catholic Education Association. We partnered with them. Annie Smith, who was a co-author, worked for the NCEA, and they allowed us to like dive deep into the weeds of this enrollment data, which was really helpful. And one of the things that I think I was amazed by is that this was a true nationwide increase in 2021, which I think says something. Because I think what I would have expected, I felt like I knew that some regions were going to have massive increases in Catholic school enrollment. So like I could bet that Virginia was going to have massive increases. Because like what you saw in Virginia, especially in Northern Virginia, you saw public schools stayed closed longer than almost any other jurisdiction in the country. You saw the parent frustration in Northern Virginia bubbling up, not just about school closure decisions, but also about some other sort of values-driven decisions that were being made. Like you saw that as a national story bubbling up. So I expected that Virginia was going to see an increase. But what really surprised me is that every single region of the country saw an increase to greater or lesser degrees. And I think that tells a story that's even more interesting than the overall increase, because I think the overall increase could have been driven by a couple of states, but it wasn't. It was driven by every region. And I think so I think that was probably the biggest surprise. I think the other surprise was, so we tried to dive into the weeds of a couple of different states in particular. So Virginia, we looked into. Florida was another state that we looked into. And what was interesting is that demographically, so the number of people that moved to Florida during COVID was relatively high. So people like moved out of New York, and it seems like they went to Florida. I don't know that that's exactly true, but that appears to be.
They came from California too.
California, right, exactly. And so what was interesting in Florida is even though the number of K-12 students in the state increased, public school enrollment was flat, but both charters and Catholic schools increased. And again, I think what that, like these like little pockets of information are telling a story of like parent demand for choice in a different way than I think we've seen recently.
Okay. Now because I was looking at the chart here, and I'm seeing that, obviously like Idaho, New Hampshire, Colorado, I mean, they had the biggest increases, but the ones that had the least, or that it looks like maybe they lost some. I'm seeing Wyoming, New York, West Virginia, Delaware, Texas. Like this doesn't really seem to be a red or blue state issue, at least when it comes to the ones who didn't increase that much. What were you kind of noticing there? Like for the regions that didn't experience as much of an increase, or maybe had a little bit of a decrease, what were some of the reasons for that?
Yeah, so I think there's two things going on there. So that chart actually looked at a 2-year. So what we did is we dove deep into the single year. So between October 2020 and October 2021, that's when we saw the nationwide increase. But we also wanted to zoom out and see a 2-year. What happened between 2019 and 2021? Because that's the whole COVID story. And so what happened, the whole COVID story was like the first year of COVID between 2019 and 2020, Catholic school enrollment did decrease, driven like most places by a real sharp decline in pre-K and kindergarten. Okay. And then in 2021, there was that massive increase, the 3.8% nationwide increase, driven again in part by a massive increase in pre-K and lower elementary enrollment. So that chart you're looking at actually shows the 2-year story. And so some of those states at the bottom they had the largest first-year drop and the smallest second-year rebound. So New York State is one of them. So New York State was hit really hard in the first year of COVID and was actually forced to close a lot of schools. So what happened in the first year of COVID was that some states lost their infrastructure, right? So like you close a school, you lose the capacity to expand is part of what happens. Like you just like the schools are gone. So there's a limited amount you can grow. It doesn't totally explain the story, but it's part of it. A state like Wyoming, it's just such a small number. So like Wyoming technically has the largest drop, but it was like 200 kids or something, right? So like it's just that there's just not that many Catholic school students in Wyoming. So the story is like one of some regions of the country experienced larger numbers of school closures in year one, which impacted their ability to rebound in year two. And I do think for like Catholic school leaders, that's part of what we have to be cautious about. Like, it is not a given. I am hopeful that the 2021 rebound is the beginning of a long-term revitalization of a sector that we all need. But that's on us. Like, it's on two people. Policymakers need to expand choice. So that's something we can all do. But also Catholic school leaders, we need to seize the moment and take control of this moment to drive change. And I think that I think there are a number of lessons that we should be grappling with internally as well.
Okay, yeah, and we're going to talk about that because I saw that in your report. I want you to talk about going forward. But I also wanted to go back to the idea that reopening the schools earlier is what pushed a lot of this. But what other factors do you think are at play? Because I mean, I'm sure that was one of the main contributors, if not the main contributor, as far as opening up early. But what other factors are motivating parents to make the switch from public to Catholic specifically?
Yeah. So I can only speak an anecdote here because I don't have the data, as much data to back it up. But what I can say anecdotally, and it'll be interesting to see, like, as we gather more survey data and learn more about what motivated parent decisions, I think we'll be able to give even more color to this. But I kind of feel like there were three things going on that came into sharp relief in the past 2.5 years. One of them was obviously COVID and schools' response to COVID, which we talked about. I think a second thing is, like, suddenly during COVID, especially during remote learning, you got, as parents, like, we got a window into our kids' instruction that we have never, like, literally never had before. Maybe you had visited a school once or twice, but every time you're walking by your child's computer to see what's going on, it just engages you in a different way. And I think it may also sort of change what is your top priority in a school that you're looking for. So I think that's a second thing that changed, like, over the past 2.5 years. And then a third thing that I think this year that we're in or that we just ended, I guess, that also changed is the issues of school safety. I think one of the things that we've seen around the country in the massive sort of return to school in 2022 is we've seen a lot across the board, a lot of spikes of discipline and safety issues in schools. And I think that the combination of those three things, like, I'm not, like, Catholic schools are not perfect. Like, we're always working, we're always trying to improve. But on those three things, Catholic schools compare very favorably. One, in the way we responded to COVID. Two, I think in terms of the instruction, like what kids are immersed in every day, like math that's rigorous and worth doing, like books that are worth reading. Like, I think a lot of Catholic schools, like, are just really thoughtful and do a really good job with that. And then when it comes to school safety, Catholic schools have always stood apart, even in some of the most dangerous communities, as being these beacons of, like, safety and hope. And so I think the combination of those three things has really made Catholic schools stand out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's a plus that y'all aren't teaching about critical race theory and helping children transition to other genders behind their parents' backs too. So but when you bring up safety, that's an interesting issue, because that's not one that I hear about when I'm having these conversations. Can you speak a little bit more on that? Are you talking about with students fighting or mass shootings or?
Yeah, I guess I'm talking more on the small scale, like the fighting, the discipline issues. Like, one of and we experienced this, right? So it was funny. So as we were preparing for the 2021-2022 school year, so I was working with our principals and our academic deans and our teachers, preparing to, like, welcome back everyone. Because remember, in 2020, 2021, we had most kids back, but not all. And in this year, we, remote instruction was done. We were back to, like, we're all here. We're all coming to school every day. That's what we need. And so we knew that there was going to be a transition for a couple of reasons. One, we had an explosion of enrollment. So we are I mentioned in Cleveland, our enrollment exploded by 40%. In New York, it exploded by 15%. So we had hundreds and hundreds of students who were coming to us, who had previously been in public schools and had literally they hadn't set foot in a classroom possibly ever for our lower elementary, or in 18 months for our, our upper elementary and middle schools, which meant all of the norms of like classroom culture and discipline and expectations, if they had ever been set, were lost. And so we had to be incredibly intentional in our early months of this year in resetting all of those norms and expectations. And I think that, and even with that, we definitely saw, more kind of like more struggles. I mean, I think it was a smaller scale stuff, but more calls home to mom and dad, more, disciplinary challenges. And that was when we were fully prepared for that. I think if you then magnify that and expand it to like what a lot of the especially the large traditional public schools were dealing with, and especially the large traditional public schools who may have struggled with school culture pre-COVID, now they're bringing back in kids that have lost those norms, as we all have. And I think just the daily discipline has become overwhelming, and in some places it has bubbled up into borderline dangerous with violence and fighting. And so I think that has been a bigger issue than maybe we're talking about.
Gotcha. So when it comes to attracting new students, I mean, what are the most common obstacles that Catholic schools have faced, and even will face going forward when it comes to attracting more people?
So I think there's a number of different things. So I think there's a couple of external factors, but I think there are also barriers that we erect ourselves as Catholic school leaders. Obviously not intentionally. We're not trying to keep like one of the...
we don't want students coming here.
Yeah, right, exactly. That would be crazy. We're struggling for enrollment. We want to open our doors wide and welcome all. So I think one of the external things is I think some people may not realize that Catholic schools are welcoming to all. Like, you do not have to be Catholic to attend a Catholic school. Right. And in fact, many of our students, I mean, in our Cleveland schools, almost none of our students are Catholic. In our New York schools, about 60-something% of our students are Catholic. So we are welcome to all. And some people ask, well, why? Like, if you're Catholic schools, and I always go back, there was a quote by James Cardinal Hickey, who was the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. a number of years ago. And he said, we don't educate our students because they are Catholic. We educate them because we are Catholic. And I think that is like really like core, particularly in urban Catholic schools, that is core to our mission. And so we welcome all. And so I think one of the external factors that is a barrier to enrollment growth is that people may not realize that we genuinely are open and welcome all. And in fact, we have lots of folks who are of different faiths, other Christian faiths. We have some Muslim students, like who just families who really love having a faith-based school, even if the faith in the school is different from theirs. So I think that's one of the external factors. Obviously, another external factor is that, roughly half of our states still don't provide choice, right? So there's and now we have this really interesting, we operate the 4 schools in Cleveland, Ohio, where our students have access to tax credits and vouchers. And then we have 7 schools in New York City where there is absolutely no public funding for private or public schools. So we live in both worlds, which is interesting. But that's another barrier to enrollment. So like in our New York City schools, our mission is to serve, families that are living in under-resourced communities. And so it is a huge sacrifice that they make. Like the median income of the students we serve in New York is something like, I think it's like $34,000 a year is the median family income. In like the most expensive city in the world. And we subsidize, obviously, the lion's share of that, but they do have to pay something to get there. Yeah. And so it's amazing to think of the sacrifices they make to like make that choice possible. So school choice is the second barrier. Okay. That said, internally, we get in our own way sometimes. And I think there are a couple of ways that we get in our own way. And one of them is that we erect these massive barriers to entry for good reason. It's like the classic, like really good intentioned, but poorly executed ideas. And so we ran into this at Partnership. So in our 7 New York schools, particularly in 2020, we also experienced and enrollment decline. And we took a pause and we were like, we need to understand what's actually happening here. And so we're data driven. We pulled all the data and tried to understand what it was telling us. And what we realized was that in order to qualify for a scholarship, you had to like jump through so many hoops in terms of paperwork barriers. It was hoops that like you and I would have trouble meeting. And so families in crisis, exactly the families we want to serve, there's no way they could have met them. So that was something we were doing to get in our own way. And so one of the things that we did in leading into 2021 was we removed the paperwork there. We completely streamlined the application process. It is a 2-page application now. You get the answer that day. You know exactly what's happening. And so that was a massive barrier to entry that again was erected for a good reason, but unintentionally kept parents out. I think maybe just to put a final point on that, like when we looked at the data, what we found is that it was something like 80% of the families that ended up not enrolling in our schools took more than a week to complete their paperwork. So like it just took them too long, and it became too much. I think another is that there's a little bit of an admissions versus an open to all mindset. So like there's a little bit of this mindset that's still like we want to be selective. And so I joke that you can be as selective as your wait list allows. Like if you are struggling to fill your seats, like you need to figure out how to serve the community that needs you, not to shut out the ones that are more challenging. And so I think that's a second barrier that we unintentionally erect for ourselves.
Gotcha. That was pretty enlightening, because I don't know that much about Catholic schools, but I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if 80% of the ones who didn't end up enrolling took a week to do the paperwork, that means that the paperwork, there's too much of it. I mean,
exactly.
If you make it too onerous, people are going to give up, you know?
Exactly. And it was like crazy things, like you had to submit your most recent, tax forms, and like, you needed to get, notarized letters. And you start to wonder, it's like it's almost like the classic, like effective bureaucracy, like unintended consequences of bureaucracy. Like you kind of know why these fences were built at one time, but it's like, did we ever take a step back and ask ourselves, are they necessary? So that's what we've tried.
Yeah. So with this increase, I mean, you don't want this to be like a one-time bump. You wanted to keep going. So what do you think that Catholic schools need to do to keep this momentum going?
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple things. So one, I think we absolutely have to look at our barriers to entry. We need to look at the things that are within our control. And I guess maybe the way to think about this is a mindset shift, right? So like, I think there's a piece of, because Catholic schools face legitimate challenges, particularly in non-choice states. And so, but I think that when you face like legitimate challenges, it becomes like a defeatism, a mindset of defeatism. Like this is something that happens to us. And so I think the first change that needs to happen is like, we need to realize that we control more of our own destiny than we might think. We don't control everything, but there's a lot that we can do. And so I think one is that mindset shift. And then I think second, I think we need to think differently about how we support and sustain, particularly our Catholic schools that serve under-resourced communities. Like we can't run them in the South Bronx the way we run them in Westchester County and Scarsdale. Like they cannot be run the same way. Because you're serving a different community. And I think that's where, so at partnership schools, like our arrangement with the diocese is unique, and it's meant to serve exactly that purpose. Like by mission, we're never going to take on any schools in suburban areas, because we are specifically here to serve a need, which is to put Catholic schools that serve the underserved on the path to long-term sustainability and academic excellence. And so I think that dioceses need to think differently about, who do I call to provide support for the schools that are most struggling? And I think that can be hard, because diocesan leaders rightly think holistically about their whole diocese. But dioceses are massive and they're diverse. And so like, I think you almost need to like chunk it out and think like, what are some non-traditional governance structures that can support our different communities differently, and that can like serve out our ministry of the church differently. And I think there are a lot of different organizations that are doing that. So like, I think Partnership Schools is a unique organization. I think another is Cristo Rey. So Cristo Rey is a national Catholic schools network that runs high schools. And part of the way that they make themselves sustainable is that they actually get corporate sponsorship. And so every Cristo Rey student goes to school 4 days a week and works 1 day a week. And so 5 students share one corporate job, and they get that salary gets paid to the network. And so, which is like, and the Cristo Rey is an amazing network. We send a lot of because our schools are K-8. So we send a lot of our graduates to Cristo Rey in New York and in Cleveland. And it's like, that is a unique, like non-traditional way to address the sustainability problem, but also to like form kids in really interesting ways. Like they are getting on the job experience from the
That's a brilliant move.
Yeah. It's really.
So it sounds like, a lot more out of the box type thinking is needed.
Yes.
Like looking for other creative ways to get support for Catholic schools, but also benefit the students, because that's what that solution does. I mean, you get your funding, but you're also offering something to people's kids that they're not going to get at a public school. I mean, work experience.
Exactly.
I mean,
and like real work experience, like you're doing a job. Like,
yeah.
That's great. So how do you see the future of this? I mean, are you optimistic? Do you see signs that people are that people within these Catholic schools and the diocese are on board with what you just laid out, or is there resistance? Because I know there are always people who don't want to change, and they want to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, God bless them, you got to love them, but I mean, you got to be able to move forward. So how do you see this shaping up? I mean, what are the signs showing you right now?
So yes, and the Catholic Church is the oldest bureaucracy in the world, and so it is not fast to change. So yes, I feel that. I am an eternal optimist. Like, and my dad who's wonderful. And when I was like in college, he shared a quote with me that I still have written down, and I think about it always, which is, great tasks are rarely achieved by cynics. And so I believe we must be optimistic if we're going to actually affect change. So I am 100% optimistic that it is within our power to change the trajectory that has been for the past 20 years, the decline of urban Catholic schools. I think there are signs that other people share this optimism. And I think we're seeing signs of that bubble up in a number of different ways. So one is, I think, philanthropy and philanthropists. Like, obviously a huge part of what we need to do to innovate is to sort of generate some philanthropic support for outside of the box thinking and non-traditional options. Like, you need some of that seed funding to be able to get the flywheel moving and to be able to affect change. And so we've been really fortunate. I mean, we wouldn't exist if it weren't for our most loyal and committed donors and philanthropists. And so I think they're like a big part of the story and a big part of the drivers of innovation. I think also, like, our expansion. So when we started, our organization started in New York City. It was actually essentially started by a group of philanthropists. So they had been giving to Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of New York for 20 years. And they took a step back and they said, okay, wait a second. Are we throwing good money after bad? Like, by just throwing money into the existing system, are we actually changing anything? And so they came up with this idea and negotiated it with Cardinal Dolan in New York, who, to his credit, as a leader of the oldest bureaucracy in the world, was willing to cast into the deep and try something very new. And they said, okay, we'll take on the financial burden in exchange for full autonomy. And it was an experiment at first, but one that worked. And so then we said, okay, if we're going to think about how we're going to affect change outside of our flagship schools in New York, we have to expand to a second diocese, because we have to prove that this is just not something idiosyncratic that only exists in New York. And so what gives me hope is that how we've been embraced and welcomed in Cleveland. Like the superintendent of the Diocese of Cleveland, Franco Lynn, has been an amazing partner, you know, bringing us in, helping to block and tackle so that we can take on these challenges. The bishop, we've actually now had 2 bishops actually in the short time we've been there. They're deputies. Nice. And so their willingness to just try something new has been, I think, has provided really great hope. So I think because of that, because of our own success, because of their willingness to welcome change and embrace something new, it's given me tremendous hope. And then I think coupled with so we partner with advocates in the school choice arena all the time, because we know, like, we got to do this together. They need quality options and we need school choice. So like we are peers and partners. And so I think the success that organizations like Invest in Ed or like the American Federation for Children, the success that they're starting to see in the policy world is another thing that gives me hope. So I feel like we are on the precipice of what I hope will be a completely new story about what the future of choice and Catholic schools both look like.
Okay, good. Hey, and my last question actually has to do with what you just mentioned. I mean, as far as school choice, I mean, when it comes to the political solution, I mean, how you guys handle, I mean, I don't know how much you can do because I know a lot of these are nonprofits. You can't really, you know, advocate for legislation and candidates and stuff like that. So I understand that. But I mean, what are you seeing politically as far as what Catholic schools are doing, or at least some of the organizations that might work on their behalf who can actually advocate for policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot. And actually, so it's true, as a 501c3, you can't lobby or advocate unless it's for something in your organization's interest. So like, I can't go lobby for something that has nothing to do with us, but actually we can be involved in advocacy for our state level school choice. Yeah. And we are happy to do that. So I mean, like, it's not our core mission. So we try to be supportive to our partners, but we're not driving it. So like, whatever you guys need that we can provide, we are happy to provide. So we have parent advocates who become parent voices for choice. You know, we have, like, as part of, so as I mentioned, you know, I'm an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So, you know, try to write on policy and write on Catholic schools and try to contribute to that dialogue. So we just try to be good partners in that effort as much as possible. In terms of the landscape, I think there are a number of things that we're, you know, excited about. I think that the push that's happened at the state level, but also at the national level, I think there's a couple different things pushing for ESAs, educational savings accounts. So there was the move during COVID, a number of states passed ESAs, and we actually took a look at it, and it looked, based on our analysis, we found that Catholic school enrollment increased more in the states that had just recently passed ESAs than in others, which I thought was interesting as well. Not surprising, but interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, definitely.
Right? So I think, like, seeing some of that, I think, is really, really heartening. But then also there's an organization called Invest in Ed that actually has been pushing forward a bill for a federal tax credit, which would be great. And I think Senator Tim Scott and a few other senators introduced it just a couple of weeks ago. And so some of that momentum and movement is happening as well. And that, like, I mean, the ultimate goal is to have state level choice so that, like, tax money follows the child. But in the interim, if there was something like a federal tax credit for states like New York or California, where it feels almost impossible to get state level choice passed, having something federal would be a huge, huge, huge boon to parents and to schools like ours.
Awesome. Now, do you know the name of the legislation that they introduced at the federal level, or?
You know what? I cannot remember it. Isn't that shameful? I should have it in front of me. I can definitely find it for you, and I will send it to you.
Awesome.
But yes, it was just recently released. So I'll ping you offline.
Okay, sweet. Well, this was an excellent conversation, very enlightening for me, because there's a lot of stuff I didn't know about Catholic schools. I'm sure other people don't know either. So we would definitely have to have you back on to talk about more of this, because I'm sure you're going to be coming out with more data. But before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Yes. So you can find me on Twitter at K Porter-Magee. So that's KPorterMagee. And you can find Partnership Schools at partnershipnyc.org or partnershipcle.org. So Partnership New York City or Partnership Cleveland. And we'd love to have folks check us out and join the fight.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me. We'll have to do it again soon.
I would love it. Thanks so much.